want to back up a little bit from our reading that was just given to us from Amos chapter 6 and kind of set the context for that. What was the situation surrounding those words from the prophet Amos? And what was going on was that a significant figure, probably not a king, but certainly some high-ranking politician, someone in the upper crust of society, whether in the northern kingdom of Israel or in the south in Judah, but some individual of that stature has passed away. And now individuals from both the northern and southern kingdom, from all of what is known as Israel, have gathered together for this funeral, for this wake. And that's very similar to what happens today when a leader of state passes away. We'll send our vice president, or we'll send a secretary of state. We may even send our own president, but gathers around all of these leaders. And so that is what has happened. And Amos sees that as a great opportunity because he has something to say to these individuals who are living kind of above and beyond the rest of their society. And so this creme de la creme that has gathered, this group of people who have been pampered in their prosperity and their boisterous banquets, they are now ignoring the cries of the poor. They are now no longer serving the people for whom they were either elected or appointed to serve. And Amos comes to the scene, and what he does is he addresses what many of us today would call social justice issues. In fact, the book of Amos is really the most social justice-minded book in the entire Bible of all 66 books. Martin Luther King Jr., for instance, gained much inspiration for his civil rights movement, and for many of his speeches, they actually quote the book of Amos. And so Amos begins kind of a laundry list to this bourgeoisie. And the first on his list is that they have moved into their ivory beds, he says in chapter 6, verse 4. Now that may fall on deaf ears for us. What is an ivory bed and what is the big deal about it? But in Amos's day, it was a status symbol. In fact, archaeologists have uncovered in the area of Samaria huge truckloads of ivory where people's houses were literally made of ivory. And Amos even says this in chapter 3 of verse 15 when he chides these individuals for living in ivory houses. A modern-day example for you and I would be when we hear some story on the news of an individual who has abused their power, their authority, their wealth, and we find out that their toilet is made of gold and the sinks in their bathroom are made of gold, and we're like, wow, what a colossal waste of resources and money to have that in your bathroom. And it wasn't just that it's gold toilets or ivory beds, but it was much more about a lifestyle that said, I'm above and beyond the ordinary folk, and I live differently, and I deserve to live differently. But then Amos goes on, and at first it looks like he's kind of going against their choice of meat, their menu, if you will. And that's because the rank and file of Amos's day, the you and I's of Amos's day, maybe 3 times a year got to eat good meat. And that would be at a religious festival in Jerusalem, 3 times a year. But this privileged class in Zion and Samaria, this class that was actually supposed to be servants of God to serve the people and make sure the people's needs were met, they were living the high life like they were kings. This is why in verse 5, the prophet points out that they have even kind of linked themselves to King David and the singing and the playing of merry songs on the harp. And while it's true, David did make music on his harp, he did so to bring glory to the Lord. And his actions were also matched by his desire that the people, the citizens whom he served, lived good lives. And so here, Amos is saying, you, the choicest part of the nation, are now anointing yourself with the choicest of oils and living completely different than everyone else. And in the midst of this party-hardy atmosphere, the leaders remained oblivious to the consequences of their actions. And here is something I think is very relatable for us. Amos is saying, you have gone so far in your lifestyle, in your indulgence, that you no longer see that your actions have consequences for the everyday person. You now no longer see that when you decide to go to war against that nation, you never go to war, you never get harmed, your family members never get harmed, but our family members go to war and they get killed. And when you make those economic deals and alliances with other nations, you don't suffer, you get richer, but because you are now importing those goods, we now can't sell our goods. And so now we are poor. And Amos is saying, you are completely indifferent to the choices that you are making and the impact those choices have on others. And then in verse 6 of chapter 6 today, he drops the bombshell when he says that they were not grieved over the ruin of Joseph. This phrase, the ruin of Joseph, it occurs numerous times in the book of Amos in numerous chapters. And again, the ruin of Joseph is trying to describe that the people of God are suffering catastrophic consequences because of the choices of a few elite. And that this elite had the attitude of, oh, well, that's just the way it goes. We're always going to have the poor. We're always going to have the lower class and the middle class with us. It's just the way things are done. What's the big deal? And so Amos comes and he begins to preach, and he's trying to draw these individuals to see the error of their ways, but they refuse to hear him. But I think an interesting question for us to ask this morning is, why does Amos call the down and outs? Why does he call those who are being afflicted by the choices of the elite, why does he call them Joseph? Now, here's where I like to say the Bible really is the original hyperlink system. Whenever a Bible writer, someone who is writing a book of the Bible, makes reference to someone else who is in the Bible, you need to envision that that's written in blue and underlined, and that you're at your computer screen, or that you're looking at your tablet, or you're looking on your phone. And what do you usually do if you're reading something and it's blue and underlined and you kind of want to know more about it? What do? You click it on, right? And then up comes another screen, another window that kind of gives you information. So I want you to imagine Joseph is blue and underlined, and we've just clicked it. And when we click it, it takes us back to the book of Genesis, and it tells us about a man named Joseph who had a father named Jacob. And Joseph was Jacob's favorite son. He had 12 sons, but he loved Joseph the most. And because of this, his brothers despised him. His brothers were supposed to look out for their baby brother. They were supposed to take care of him. They were supposed to help him along and help him learn the ways of life as he matured into adulthood. But they did none of that. Instead, when Jacob gave his son Joseph a magnificent coat of many colors, again signifying that Joseph was the favored son, that Joseph was going to receive the bulk of the family inheritance, the brothers ripped that coat off and sold Joseph to some Midianites who were going from Gilead and on their way to Egypt. And then, once Joseph made his way into Egypt as a slave, he began to work for a guy named Potiphar. And Potiphar was a high-ranking official, and after watching Joseph for a while, he became impressed, and he put Joseph in charge of his household and all of his business. And Joseph did a good job. But Genesis chapter 39 says Joseph was a well-built man and very handsome. And so Potiphar's wife came to Joseph, and she tried to seduce Joseph and enter into a relationship with Joseph, to which Joseph said, I can't do that kind of thing to my boss, and I certainly can't do that kind of action against my God. And so the spurned woman went for Joseph's jugular, and she accused him of all kinds of things, and no one came to his defense, and he was condemned to prison. While he is in prison, he meets Pharaoh's cupbearer, and the two of them make plans for how they're going to bust out of that place one day. The cupbearer gets freed from prison, and he forgets about Joseph and their plan for 2 whole years. Then Pharaoh has a couple of dreams that trouble him. No one in all of Egypt can interpret them, and then the cupbearer says, I got it. I know the guy who can help you, Pharaoh. And he brings Joseph up, to which then Joseph interprets the dreams and becomes part of Pharaoh's court. But here's the thing to keep in mind. All of that took 23 years. For 23 years, Joseph was essentially imprisoned for something he did not do. And more than that, he was imprisoned because of the way his own family members, his own blood, treated him. Imagine being falsely accused by your own family and then serving 23 years in prison because of your own family, the family that was supposed to raise you and nurture you and love you, did that to you. And for 23 years, you suffered. That is the hyperlink Amos wants us to hear when we hear the ruin of Joseph. That the down and outs of Israel's society, that they were like Joseph, that their brothers, their own family members, have now become this elite status who, instead of taking care of them and providing for them and defending them and nurturing them, are doing the exact opposite. And so it's fitting that Amos speaks of Joseph's ruin, because it was Joseph who cried out in distress when his own brothers threw him into a pit. And while Joseph wept, do you know what the book of Genesis says his brothers did? They went and had a big meal. Just like what Amos is saying. They're having their meals, they're having their parties, they're having their gatherings at the expense and on the backs of the people. Israel's leaders were too busy lounging on their couches, enjoying their food and drink, and strumming away on their harps to care about the ruin of their brother Joseph. And so Joseph symbolizes the poor and the oppressed people throughout the book of Amos, who together with those elite were to form one body, the people known as Israel. The Lord rescued this nation out of Egypt so that, among other things, they could always take care of one another. Not too terribly different than what the ideal is for us as a church, for us as a congregation. We're to love one another. We're to care for one another. We're to bear one another's burdens. We're to be strong where others are weak. We are to help where others are not able to help themselves. And all of this gives us critical background for when we go into the Gospels. You see, everything Jesus ever said, ever did, or ever taught is deeply rooted in the Old Testament. It comes from the Old Testament background. And so everything Amos has been talking about finds its way into a very important teaching of Jesus. Jesus in Luke chapter 16, beginning in verse 19, tells a parable about a very affluent man who is one of the notables, one of the leaders of his day, who wore only the best clothing and was consumed with only the finest of things. And outside the door of this man's home, this noble man's home, this man who had all kinds of connections to get things done, outside of his door lay a man named Lazarus, who was hungry and poor and had boils. In other words, he needed some health care. And this noble had the means to provide the health care, but did not. This noble had the means to provide food and shelter, but did not. But it is important to note this about this individual. He did not harm Lazarus. He did not persecute Lazarus. He did not force Lazarus to go away. Jesus' point is the same exact point Amos is making. That is, the man was simply indifferent to Lazarus. The leaders of Amos's day exhibited the same indifference. They ignored God's call for justice and righteousness, and instead they mouthed pious words and actions. So here's the thing for you today. If you're brave enough, if you're daring enough, if you want to take your relationship with God to another level and you want to mature spiritually, here is the introspective question for you today to guide you in prayer, journaling, and meditation for the rest of the week, especially now as you'll be more aware of it. And that is this question: what are you indifferent to in your world? What is going on in your immediate sphere of influence that you are actually apathetic to? What heartache is actually happening around you that you simply look the other way, or you rationalize why you caring about it or you not caring about it really doesn't make that big a difference, because in the end, what could you really do anyway? And so you don't harm anybody, you don't shove anybody away, you don't do anything. You just show indifference when God has presented you with a person of pain. Frank Layden was a former coach of the NBA team, the Utah Jazz. And once he had a problem with one of his star players. And he finally summoned the individual to his office. He looked the player in the eye and said, "Look, I don't understand what's going on with you. Is it ignorance or is it apathy?" To which the player said, "Coach, I don't know and I don't care." Ignorance and apathy. Too often, that can describe our lives as well. When we look, we don't even have to look in the news and on the other side of the world, though we certainly can and do that. Even in our own spheres and our offices that we work at, the buildings we go to school in, the neighborhoods that we now are taking our walks now that it's getting to be some better weather. We see wrecked and ruined lives, and we say under our breath, "I don't know. I don't care. What could I really do anyways to make a difference?" Kitty Genovese makes this point very clear. Kitty was a woman who was murdered in a New York subdivision, a subdivision much like the ones that surround Immanuel's congregation, filled with people, filled with families. And the day Kitty was murdered, it took 30 minutes for this assault to take place. It was a 30-minute assault in broad daylight in the middle of the neighborhood. And 38 people watched all 30 minutes of it. 38 people watched for 30 minutes as a woman lost her life. This perplexed authorities, this perplexed scientists and psychologists, so much so that they did a study of it. And when they studied this, they found it wasn't that these 38 individuals were just Satan incarnate and evil people and wanted harm done. It was this. Each of those 38 people, the reason they didn't do anything was they each were assuming someone else would do something about it. That someone else would call 911. That someone else would yell out the window. That someone else would come to the aid. That someone else would do something. And so, by and large, they were indifferent and did not act. What are you apathetic about in your life? What is God calling you to be passionate about? Bill Hybels used to call this the holy discontent. That is, each and every one of you, and I mean that, each and every one of you has something inside of you that makes you mad when you hear about it, that makes you, when you hear it, you get interested and you want to know about it and you want it fixed or you want to get involved. It's a holy discontent. God has put it in each one of his people. When they hear about injustice or unrighteousness, when they hear of unfairness, when they hear of ungodliness, different things for different people ring different bells, but we all have a holy discontent. Don't assume someone else has it and that someone else will do it. God has called you to do it. The solution to our apathy comes in the one who was treated just like Joseph. In fact, it's no coincidence in the Bible that he's the son of Joseph, which is the Bible's way of letting us know he's in the image of Joseph. He is like Joseph. Joseph, the son of Joseph, Jesus, was also despised and rejected by his own people. He was a man of sorrows and he was familiar with suffering. And he was mocked by a crowd. He was betrayed by Judas. He was denied by Peter. He was forsaken by 10. He was unjustly accused in a kangaroo court. And he was sentenced to death by a weak-willed governor. And then he was crowned with thorns by those who spat upon him and muscle men who beat him to within an inch of his life. But Christ's love, the love of God that flowed through Jesus Christ, that love was anything but apathetic. It was the exact opposite of those that Amos describes. So instead of indifference in baptism, he gives us grace. And instead of neglect in communion, he gives us a foretaste of the feast to come. And instead of unconcern, the gospel says we get to share in his victory. And instead of divine apathy, we have a God who saw our need, who saw our eternal fate, who saw all of inside of our hearts. And instead of being apathetic and assuming we would either fix it ourselves or someone else would do it, our God sends his Son to redeem us and rescue us. And it is that love given to us in Jesus Christ that empowers us to have victory over apathy, unconcern, and indifference in our own lives. So now, in Christ, we not only grieve over Joseph's ruin, that is, when our fellow human being hurts, we hurt. And when something breaks God's heart, it breaks our heart. And when something causes Jesus to cry, it should cause us to shed a tear as well. And now we help those hurting people in our world. And we're motivated by Christ's love to help those who are the least, the lost, and the last among us. This week, spend time in prayer. What am I apathetic towards in my life? What is my holy discontent to which God is calling me to action where I can bring the transforming love of Jesus Christ to? Amen.